do you think um, the goal of NATO, the U.S. and NATO, but pretty much the U.S. Um, with their bludgeoning of Russia through Ukraine, and then their proposed pivot to Asia to fight China?
Insecurity. They just see the world has shifted out of their control. I mean, ultimately, NATO's entire creation was to manifest what failed to manifest that they tried to do with the League of Nations Article 10 and Article 16, which was the collective security pact of the League of Nations Covenant, which fortunately was rejected by the nationalists in America around Warren Harding, who later, after Harding dies in 23 of oyster poisoning, no autopsy, then the nationalists, they go on and their new focus is to try to cultivate and organize Franklin Roosevelt, which they do. But that League of Nations Covenant, 10 and 16, like I said, articles, were the secret, the special sauce to what would make perpetual war happen effectively. And Article 5 of NATO is effectively that, and the idea of NATO was to just always get around the elements of the United Nations Charter, and especially the United Nations Security Council, which gave nations that did pretty much most of the heavy lifting, putting down the fascist machinery, China and Russia in World War II, right? Like, this is mostly, we pat ourselves on the back about having been the cause of stopping Hitler. No, the cause of stopping Hitler was Russia and China. Mm-hmm. Mao directly played the key role in China. 10 million Chinese lost their lives. 25 million or more Russians lost their lives. Stalin and Mao, the two great threats and enemies that were created for us to be afraid of during the Cold War, of McCarthyism and John Burke Society and all that stuff. They were the cause of why the Wall Street London bankers dictatorship under fascism failed. Okay, so NATO was created to get around that. Because the UN Security Council was done with the collaboration of Russia and China and the United States together, working to enshrine the sacredness of national sovereignty into the structure of the UN. That was very different from the League of Nations. The League of Nations was a one world government entity. The UN Charter, or the UN, was originally designed, despite its corruption, and there was infiltrated. The moment Roosevelt dies, this thing is taken over or infiltrated, but there's still structures that give way too much power to nation states to intervene on things like the Vietnam War or Korean War or whatever else, which would have had to have passed through the UN Security Council. And also the charter bans aggressive wars between states, right? That's illegal in the UN Charter's principles. And that's why the NATO had to be created as a way to get around the China-Russia veto, as well as the influence of other nations who had a vote in the UN structure. And so NATO was created by a grouping of Rhodes Scholars centered around this guy, Escott Reed, in 1947, who was an anti-American, a rabid pro-British anti-American Canadian, Rhodes Scholar, guy who co-founds the Canadian Fabian Society, sets up, get this, in 1947, a conference justifying the need to have a U.S.-run global empire under NATO. How is that, right? These paradoxes, people should chew on these paradoxes, because why? It's because Roosevelt is dead, right? All of the actual authentic Americans are now purged from government. So America is now sufficiently under the influence of the British hand that it can be trusted to be the dumb giant enforcer under an American-led governing structure. And NATO was the key to getting around that. And then things like R2P, the responsibility to protect protocol that allows for humanitarian wars, was then brought in the 90s and supported by the neocons and liberal imperialists alike. But yeah, that's the thing with NATO. So I mean, it's insecure. They just see Russia, China have just won over nations representing 89% of the world population to a different way of thinking about the new system that's going to be brought online that has nothing to do with depopulation. And so they're just flailing in the wind right now. They're hectically freaked out, and I think they're getting sloppier and sloppier, from Ukraine to Taiwan, to Japan, and I mean, it's sloppiness and fear.